And our second feature today, celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the Russian Revolution, journalist, political analyst, RT reporter, veteran activist of the Occupy Wall Street movement, and, with a perspective you never hear about from the corporate media, the two sides to every story School of Journalism. Here's Caleb Maupin.
Hi, and welcome to the show.
Great.
And what do you feel is the importance, impact, and significance of its historical moment in time of the Russian Revolution 100 years ago, and whose centennial is being celebrated this week?
Well, the Russian Revolution was an earth-shaking event. There's a famous anecdote where Zhou Enlai, a famous Chinese leader, was asked in the 1970s, what will be the impact of the French Revolution? What do you think the impact of the French Revolution was? And he said, well, it's too soon to tell. Well, that had been, 200 years before, but he said it was still too soon to tell, and you never know the lasting impact of world events. As you see the media kind of retelling the Russian Revolution as we approach the 100th anniversary, for the most part, we hear just demonization of the Russian Revolution, this idea that this was atrocious, the Soviet Union was evil, this kind of standard anti-communism. And then on the other side, we do hear there's a small school of folks that are trying to kind of romanticize the Russian Revolution. And I think both of them are kind of missing the point, which is that the Russian Revolution, there was a lot of heroic things that happened. There were a lot of people taking great risks and doing really heroic activities. But it was really a dark time in the history of Russia. I mean, if you go to Russia these days, people remember this as this period is considered to be one of the harder and darker periods in the history of the country. And that the people were doing heroic things and taking great risks and fighting for their lives, but they were doing it in kind of a kill or be killed situation. And really what made the Russian Revolution happen was the fact that the Bolsheviks were the only substantial political party that wanted to end the war. That World War I was happening, people were dying, and the population of Russia did not want that war to continue. They did not feel a need to keep fighting with the Germans, keep aligning with the British and the Americans against the Germans and the Austrians. That was not what they wanted to be doing. And the Bolsheviks were the only force that really offered a way out. We know about peace, land, and bread, but peace was probably the primary drive behind what drove people in October of 1917 to support the Bolsheviks.
And what do you see as the legacy of the Russian Revolution on the present and the future?
Well, here's where it's interesting because, the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution was quite painful. You had, I believe, 15 different countries that invaded Soviet Russia and then later the Soviet Union trying to put down the revolution. You had, a blockade that was set up, a humanitarian crisis created. It wasn't really until 1928, over 10 years later, that you really saw the results of the Russian Revolution begin to take effect, and that was with the 5-year plans. And that was when you saw the industrialization of the Soviet Union. And, starting in 1929, the rest of the world was having a Great Depression, but the Soviet Union became the world's leading producer of steel, the world's leading producer of tractors. You saw, barren countrysides lit up with electricity, modern apartment buildings, running water. You saw a third world, impoverished agrarian country really overnight become a world industrial power and just really drastically raise up its standard of living. And that was done with a centrally planned economy. They had the 5-year plans in which the population was mobilized to raise the country up from poverty. And today, the fact that Russia is so powerful today and is a superpower even today is very much a result of that development, of what happened with the socialist industrialization. And it's important to point out that you couldn't have had the Chinese Revolution of 1949 without the Russian Revolution of 1917, that Mao Zedong was very dependent on Soviet aid and Soviet assistance, Soviet military training. And China has rapidly turned around. China has gone from being the sick man of Asia, one of the poorest countries in the world, to being now today China is the second largest economy in the entire world. So, the standard of living has drastically increased for the people of China. In fact, the world tourism industry right now is having a boom because people whose grandparents were illiterate, malnourished peasants are now going on vacation to places like Paris and London and here in New York City and elsewhere. And the aftermath of the Russian Revolution is really massive. I mean, and even today, I mean, let's look at some of those statistics. I mean, 53% of millennials in the United States say that they prefer socialism over capitalism. And, this idea in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was an attempt to say that socialism or communism or the ideals of the Russian Revolution just perished. They died with the Soviet Union. That's really not the case. I mean, in Latin America, there are a number of governments now that are inspired by Marxism. You have the Venezuelan government, you have the Bolivian government, you have the government of Ecuador, you have the government of Nicaragua. Socialist ideas are very well alive. Socialist principles are very well alive. And the Russian Revolution really lives on as kind of a defining moment in the history of anti-capitalism.
Well, there is also thought that in that particular election, that it was actually a coup and the Communist Party really won that election.
Which election are you referring to?
With Yeltsin.
Oh, well, 1996, I mean, there's all this talk of Russian meddling in the United States, right? I mean, there's 5 different congressional and 5 different investigations into alleged Russian meddling. Well, there's no question that the United States meddled in the 1996 election in Russia. There's no question about that. I mean, it happened undisputedly. You can read. I mean, it's bragged about at the Bill Clinton library, at his presidential library, that they worked very hard to make sure that Boris Yeltsin won the election. And the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union was not a beautiful time. People have it in their head that in the 90s, people in Russia were just running around happy that they were free. The reality is, the fall of the Soviet Union was an economic catastrophe. I mean, the rate of suicide was very high. The rate of heroin addiction was very high. You had 30% unemployment at some times. You had, people losing their life savings, and you just had the national humiliation of a country. I mean, the 1990s and the fall of the Soviet Union was a humanitarian catastrophe. There are some analysts who even use the term economic genocide. Because at that point, roughly 10% of Russia's population either left the country out of economic desperation or died. The population of Russia decreased by 10% in the 1990s. So the fall of the Soviet Union was not this glorious, triumphant assertion of freedom and capitalism and democracy. It was quite a catastrophe. And if you look at Russia today, I was just in Russia recently. I was just there for the World Festival of Youth and Students. The way that Russia has been able to get their economy back in order and begun to start rising and solidifying their standard of living has been mainly with public ownership of oil and natural gas. Starting in 2000 and really, culminating in 2006, the Putin government, renationalized and reasserted public control over their major natural resources. And you've got Gazprom and Rosneft, these two, giant government-controlled entities that sell oil and natural gas on the international markets. And Russia's economy has really restabilized itself with what you might call a socialist idea, which is public control of oil and natural gas.
Now, speaking of which, you've been on location in Red Square in Moscow leading up to the centennial of the Russian Revolution. What was the effect on you or insight of that experience?
Well, there's a lot of division in Russia about how to remember the Russian Revolution. And one of the most interesting things that I thought was, in the USA, we have this idea that Stalin is just, the symbol of pure evil. You have a lot of people who say, well, Lenin was good, he had good intentions, Stalin was evil. In Russia, it's almost the opposite. In Russia, Stalin is more popular than Lenin. People associate Lenin with, the hardship that immediately followed the revolution, with, the blockade, with the suffering and the turmoil. But people associate Stalin with the industrialization and Russia becoming a strong country and the strength and defeating the Nazis, the defeat of the Nazi invaders. So Stalin is much more widely loved. But that's not to say people in Russia don't love Lenin. I mean, there is a Communist Party in Russia that is very strong, led by Zhuganov. They have a very large presence. They're represented in the government. They consider themselves to be, Marxist-Leninists, and Lenin's mausoleum is up there. There was a move from the Liberal Democratic Party, which is a smaller political party in Russia, to get rid of the mausoleum where Lenin Lenin's body is on display, and it was defeated. And the Communist Party was opposed to it. Vladimir Putin was opposed to it, and the mausoleum of Lenin, in which his body is on display, remains there. I mean, Russians consider the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution to be a part of their country. Now, there's disagreement about how to interpret it, but they largely, they consider that period in their history to be a part of their history they don't completely write off and reject. And that's almost a universal sentiment, that this is a part of their history that is worth remembering. And it's interesting because, we have this notion in the USA that the Soviet Union was just, a horrendous, evil thing, and that feeling is not widespread in Russia. There are feelings that it had flaws, that contributed to its downfall, but many Russians do identify with that. And, you can buy T-shirts of Stalin. You can buy T-shirts of Lenin. There's even, you can buy T-shirts of Trotsky, and especially now it's very interesting. Red Square is experiencing a boom of what they call red tourism. And it's mainly Chinese people because, there's this huge rise in the standard of living in China. People are going on vacation. A lot of Chinese people are going to Red Square for their vacation and visiting sites in Russia associated with the history of communism, because obviously communism is very important to the people in China. So there's a huge amount of tourism from China to Russia to see sites associated with the history of communism. So that's worth noting, and I noticed that when I was in Red Square.
And speaking of Poles, a lot of Poles in Russia people say they would like to see the return of the Soviet Union.
Yes, well, that is the truth, and the Soviet Union is not remembered as some dark time. I mean, under the Soviet Union, people were guaranteed jobs, guaranteed health care, guaranteed education, and all of that was just taken away. It was a humanitarian catastrophe. I know one Russian person told me, they said during those times when they talk about the 1990s, they said we weren't trying to live, we were simply trying to survive, and that the fall of the Soviet Union was very much a catastrophe for the population.
And what can listeners find on your website?
Oh, well, I've written a lot. I'm a journalist. I do work with RT. I do. You can visit my website at calebmaupin.com. That's CalebMaupin.com. That's my website. And if you're interested, you can even subscribe to my weekly newsletter of articles that I've written or reports that I've done that comes out once a week. You can subscribe to that on the website. Can I touch on one thing? I think one thing that's forgotten is the impact that the Soviet Union had on the United States, and that the black freedom struggle in the United States was definitely impacted by the Russian Revolution. Black people in the United States have been fighting for their rights the entire history of them being here. However, the Soviet Union made a point of aiding the black freedom struggle. If you look at, the lynching of Emmett Till in 1954, the Soviet Union took the picture of this young African-American man who'd been brutally murdered by Southern racists, and they sent it all over the world. And they said, the USA says they believe in democracy and freedom. This is what they're really about. And that put a huge amount of pressure on the U.S. government. And it was in the context of the aftermath of the lynching of Emmett Till and the Soviet Union's role in kind of exposing that we had, the beginnings of the modern phase of the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr. And, in the 1930s, the Communist Party, which was aligned with the Soviet Union, they were one of the main groups that was speaking out against Jim Crow segregation. In fact, one of the only groups that vocally spoke out against racism. And many black activists, not just Paul Robeson, but, Langston Hughes, many African-American activists were aligned with the Communist Party. And the aid that the Soviet Union gave to the black freedom struggle by having rallies in Red Square in Moscow against the Ku Klux Klan and against lynching, that had a massive impact on U.S. history. And you can also talk about other impacts the Soviet Union had on our lives. We wouldn't have weekends and unemployment insurance and those kind of things if it weren't for the aid and the support that the Communist Party received from the Soviet Union and the efforts that they made to fight for labor rights and such. But especially the aid to the black freedom struggle, it shouldn't be forgotten that the Soviet Union had a very, very important role to play in the history of the United States, and we shouldn't forget that. And it's worth noting that the Russian national anthem, the music is still the same music as the Soviet national anthem. The lyrics have been changed, but it's still the same music. And just outside, I had a hotel near Red Square. Just outside my hotel, there was a huge statue of the head of Karl Marx. And Karl Marx was not a Russian, but his image is on display. Statues of Lenin are everywhere in Moscow these days.
Since you mentioned the anthem, I'm going to play some of Paul Robeson singing the anthem. That's something quite memorable. Okay, well, thank you so much, Caleb Maupin, for calling into our show.
Sure, it's a pleasure.
United forever in friendship and labor, our mighty republics will ever endure. The great Soviet Union will live through the ages, the dream of a people, their fortress secure. Long live our Soviet motherland, built by the people's mighty hand. Long live her people, united and free, strong in a friendship tried by fire. Long may our crimson flag inspire, shining in glory for all men to see. Through days dark and stormy, while great Lenin led us, our eyes saw the bright sun of freedom above. And Stalin, our leader, with faith in the people, inspired us to build the land that we love. For the future, destroyed the invader, and brought to our homeland the laurels of fame. Our glory will live in the memory of nations, and all generations will honor her name. Long live our Soviet motherland, built by the people's mighty hand. Long live her people, united and free, strong in a friendship tried by fire. Long may our crimson flag inspire, shining in glory for all men to see.
And by the way, the iconic Paul Robeson, whom you just heard singing, was later likely driven to his death by the unrelenting hounding and persecution from McCarthyism. And that's all we have time for today on Arts Express, Expression in the Arts. And if you'd like to express yourself too, you can write to theradiogoddess@gmail.com. Thank you to our engineer, Reggie Johnson. Till next time for Arts Express. And if you're down with the status quo, take the local. This is Prairie Miller leaving the station.